breaking news update. War Machine was sentenced today to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 36 years.
But I do know when I get out, when he gets out, he will kill me.
There's a guy named Husamar Paul Harris who is one of the scariest motherfuckers to ever fight because he was a leg lock specialist.
Okay.
And what he would do is rip your knees apart. And he wouldn't let go when you tapped.
You know, the stuff like the eye gouging, the hit after the bell, all that stuff, that will not ever be tolerated. And he's done. I don't care if he fights in every show all over the world and becomes the best, and everybody thinks he's the pound-for-pound best in the world. He will never fight in the UFC ever again. Done.
Wait a minute, this guy was suspended for 5 years and got a $150,000 fine for marijuana?
Flagrantly abuse it in that way, where you're openly showing them that you don't give a fuck about them. You don't care about their career. You don't care that it's the only way they have to make a living. And you're just gonna ban them for life because they missed a drug test.
Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video we'll cover why the UFC chose to ban some of these fighters. So sit back, pop a white monster, and enjoy.
Local MMA fighter wanted for a vicious attack on his ex-girlfriend is behind bars tonight. The manhunt for War Machine involved Dog the Bounty Hunter. But as 10 News reporter Rial Creighton explains, U.S. Marshals beat him to the arrest today.
I don't even know half of what happened to my daughter, even after the trial. I have no idea. She still won't talk to me about it.
It was kind of a piece of work, you know. Man, what a nut.
War Machine wasn't always a monster. Back in 2007, he was just another hungry young blood. With his 6 feet tall build and decent wrestling credentials, he caught the UFC's attention during the 6th season of The Ultimate Fighter. The reality show was supposed to be his big break, a chance to prove he belonged among the elite. But even then, the warning signs were there. His teammates and coaches noticed something off about his temperament, the way he carried himself, the things he said when the cameras weren't rolling. But talent has a way of masking character flaws, at least for a while. He made it to the UFC roster and started building what looked like a promising career. His first fight was against Jared Rollins at UFC 84. He won by submission in the 2nd round. The performance was solid, technical, exactly what you'd expect from a hungry newcomer. For a moment, it seemed like War Machine might actually live up to his potential. But success in the octagon requires more than just physical skills. It requires discipline, professionalism, and the ability to separate your fighting persona from your real life. And that's where everything started to unravel. War Machine's problems began with his mouth. He had a habit of making controversial statements that put the UFC in uncomfortable positions. But the breaking point came in 2008, after fellow fighter Evan Tanner died tragically in the desert. While the MMA community mourned the loss of a respected veteran, War Machine posted something unthinkable on his MySpace page. He speculated that Tanner had deliberately gone to the desert to take his own life. He suggested that Tanner was depressed about his career and finances and had chosen to end everything in that remote location. It was cruel, baseless, and completely inappropriate. Even after medical examiners confirmed that Tanner's death was accidental, War Machine refused to apologize or retract his statements. The UFC had seen enough. Dana White and the promotion cut ties with him immediately. It wasn't just about the Tanner comments, though. That was the final straw. It was about a pattern of behavior that showed War Machine couldn't represent the organization professionally. He was done, banned from ever returning to the octagon. But getting kicked out of the UFC was just the beginning of War Machine's descent into darkness. Over the next few years, his behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. He bounced between smaller promotions, never able to recapture the momentum he'd once had. His personal life spiraled out of control. Then came August 2014, the night that changed everything. War Machine broke into the home of his ex-girlfriend, adult film actress Christy Mack. What happened next was so brutal, so horrific, that it shocked even hardened law enforcement officials. He beat her nearly to death, breaking bones, fracturing teeth, and leaving her with injuries that required multiple surgeries. The attack lasted hours. Mack later described it as the longest night of her life, convinced she was going to die. When it was over, War Machine fled, becoming the subject of a massive manhunt that ended with his capture 6 days later. The trial revealed the full extent of his crimes: 29 felony charges, kidnapping, sexual assault, attempted murder. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony devastating. In 2017, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 36 years. Jonathan Koppenhaver went from UFC prospect to convicted felon, proving that some people can't handle the platform that fighting gives them.
Mr. Diaz?
Well, respectfully, we disagree with your interpretation of the laws, and albeit you may be governed by your commission's regulations, I believe the United States Constitution and the Nevada state constitution trump those regulations. But proceed with your misinterpretation of the law.
Wait a minute, this guy was suspended for 5 years and got a $150,000 fine for marijuana. So you can completely take that out of context too, but that's his third offense. It's his third offense. And, you know, let's all be honest here. Nick Diaz doesn't exactly play by the rules.
The Nevada State Athletic Commission hit Nick Diaz with a 5-year suspension. That's longer than some people spend in college. And for a fighter in their prime, that might as well be a career death sentence. But how did one of the most beloved anti-heroes in mixed martial arts history go from headlining pay-per-views to being completely blacklisted by the sport's biggest stage? Nick Diaz wasn't just any fighter. He was the guy who showed up to press conferences in flip-flops. The guy who talked trash like poetry. The guy who made cardio look effortless while his opponents gasped for air. He was real in a world full of manufactured personas, and that authenticity made him dangerous, not just in the cage, but to the entire system. September 12, 2015, UFC 183 in Las Vegas. Nick Diaz stepped into the octagon for what would become his final UFC performance against Anderson Silva, the legendary Spider himself. It was supposed to be a dream fight between two icons. Silva, the former middleweight king trying to reclaim his throne. Diaz, the Stockton slugger looking to prove he belonged among the elite after a 1.5-year layoff. The fight itself was vintage Nick Diaz. Pressure, volume, relentless forward movement. He pushed Silva to the limit, even dropping the Brazilian legend in the 3rd round. But when the scorecards were read, Silva got the decision. Controversial? Absolutely. But that wasn't the real problem. The real nightmare was just beginning. 3 months later, the bombshell dropped. Nick Diaz had tested positive for marijuana metabolites in his post-fight drug screening. This wasn't his first rodeo with cannabis violations. He'd been popped before, back in 2007 after his fight with Gomi, and again in 2012 following his war with Carlos Condit. But this time was different. This time, the Nevada State Athletic Commission decided to make an example out of him. The hearing was a circus. Nick sat there, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet, while commissioners grilled him about his marijuana use. His lawyer argued that marijuana wasn't a performance-enhancing drug, that it was for anxiety, for sleep, for dealing with the pressures of being a public figure in a violent sport. But the commission wasn't interested in compassion or common sense. They wanted blood. They wanted to send a message. And Nick Diaz became their sacrificial lamb. 5 years. The punishment was so absurd, so disproportionate to the crime, that even people who'd never watched a UFC fight were outraged. Athletes from other sports spoke out. Fans launched campaigns. The media called it what it was, a witch hunt. Here was a fighter who'd never popped for steroids, never cheated, never hurt anyone outside the cage, getting buried alive for using a plant that was already legal in multiple states. The ban destroyed what should have been Nick's prime years. He was 32 when they suspended him. By the time he could legally compete again, he'd be 37. In fight years, that's ancient. The sport moves fast, and 5 years is an eternity. New stars rise, old legends fade, and the world forgets you ever existed. But here's the thing about Nick Diaz. He never begged, never groveled, never played their political games. He just disappeared, living his life on his own terms while the sport he'd helped build continued without him. The UFC eventually brought him back for one final payday against Robbie Lawler in 2021, but by then, the damage was done. The fire was gone. The timing was wrong. Nick Diaz's banishment wasn't just about marijuana. It was about power. About what happens when you refuse to play by someone else's rules in a world that demands conformity. They tried to break him, tried to make him disappear. But legends don't disappear, they just become myths. And Nick Diaz's myth will outlast every commissioner who tried to bury him.
And this is the second incident we've had with Paul Harris, where he had the lock and he didn't let it go. Finally, he let it go, but yeah, I'm going to cut him too.
You're going to cut him. This is it. You're saying here right now on the record, not just a suspension, he's done.
He's done.
And these guys would be screaming in agony and slapping and tapping.
Saying, "I'm out."
And he would be still twisting. And he was built like a human pit bull.
Right.
He was like 5'7", 185 pounds of solid muscle. And he would just dive on your legs and roll into these positions and rip your knees apart.
The Brazilian submission specialist Raucimar Palhares looked unstoppable. He had built a reputation as one of the most dangerous grapplers in mixed martial arts. His leg locks were legendary, his heel hooks were devastating, but there was something darker lurking beneath the surface, something that would ultimately cost him everything. This is the story of a fighter whose talent was matched only by his inability to let go. And it's a cautionary tale about what happens when the line between competition and cruelty gets crossed one too many times. Palhares wasn't just good at submissions, he was terrifying. When he grabbed your leg, you were in serious trouble. The man they called Toquinho had perfected the art of heel hooks and ankle locks to a level that few fighters could match. His technique was flawless, His grip strength was inhuman, and his timing was perfect. But here's where things get complicated. In mixed martial arts, when your opponent taps out, you let go immediately. It's not just sportsmanship, it's basic human decency. The tap is a universal signal that says stop before something breaks, before permanent damage occurs, before a career ends in an instant. Palhares had other ideas. The first major incident happened during his time with the UFC. Against Mike Pierce in 2013, the Brazilian caught his opponent in a heel hook that had Pierce tapping frantically. Both his hand and his voice were screaming into submission. The referee was moving to stop the fight, but Palhares wouldn't release the hold. He cranked harder. Pierce's desperate taps became more frantic. The referee had to physically force the Brazilian to let go. This wasn't a split-second mistake. This wasn't a fighter caught up in the heat of the moment. This was deliberate, calculated, dangerous. The UFC investigated the incident. They reviewed the footage. They spoke with officials. And their conclusion was clear. Rousimar Palhares was too dangerous to compete in their organization. Not because of his skill level, but because of his complete disregard for his opponent's safety. Dana White didn't mince words. The promotion cut Palhares immediately. They made it clear that fighters who couldn't respect the tap had no place in professional mixed martial arts. It was a decision that sent shockwaves through the combat sports world. But the story doesn't end there, because Palhares took his dangerous habits to other organizations. At the World Series of Fighting, he continued his pattern of holding submissions too long. Against Jake Shields, not only did he maintain a Kimura well past the point of submission, but he also poked his opponent's eyes during the scramble. The footage is uncomfortable to watch. Shields is clearly in distress. His corner is screaming for the referee to intervene, and Palhares is methodically applying more pressure, seemingly oblivious to his opponent's suffering. What makes this even more disturbing is the psychological aspect. Palhares knew exactly what he was doing. He understood the rules, he comprehended the potential consequences, but he chose to ignore them anyway. Some fighters lose themselves in the heat of competition. Palhares appeared to find himself in those moments of cruelty. The pattern became undeniable. Multiple organizations, multiple incidents, multiple opponents left wondering if their careers might end not from a clean finish, but from unnecessary brutality after they'd already surrendered. Today, Rousimar Palhares serves as a reminder that skill without sportsmanship is worthless. That talent without character leads nowhere. His legacy isn't defined by the submissions he secured, but by the trust he shattered and the safety he compromised. In a sport built on mutual respect between warriors, he chose to be something else entirely, and the sport chose to move on without him.
It's sort of changed. Like, Vanderlei's public opinion right now is very high. Like, people like him again. And one of the reasons why they like him is because he got fucked over by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Hardcore. They banned him for life for missing a drug test, which I just think is fucking tyranny. I think that's straight bullshit. I think that is a fucking horrible miscarriage of justice. If you think the guy was doing something, then you fine him and you ban him for the amount of time that you need to based on if he was guilty.
The axe murderer had a reputation that preceded him into every octagon. Wanderlei Silva wasn't just a fighter, he was a force of nature. Wild swinging hooks, relentless pressure, and a stare that could freeze blood. For over a decade, he terrorized opponents in Pride Fighting Championships and later the UFC. But in 2014, everything came crashing down. One failed drug test, one moment of panic, and suddenly the most feared man in mixed martial arts was banned for life. This is the story of how a legend destroyed his own legacy in a single afternoon. When Wanderlei Silva signed with the UFC in 2007, he brought with him a highlight reel that looked like something out of a horror movie. 17 knockouts in Pride, most of them brutal, most of them unforgettable. The man had built his entire career on being unpredictable, dangerous, and absolutely terrifying. His fights weren't contests, they were wars, and for years that formula worked perfectly. But by 2013, the writing was on the wall. Silva was aging, slowing down, taking more damage than he was dishing out. His last few performances had been lackluster at best. Still, when the UFC booked him against Chael Sonnen at UFC 175, fans were excited. Two legends, one final showdown. What nobody expected was what happened next, May 24th, 2014, a date that would change everything. The Nevada State Athletic Commission showed up at Wanderlei's Las Vegas gym for a random drug test. Standard procedure for a fighter preparing for a major bout. But when the testers arrived, Silva did something that shocked everyone involved. He ran. Literally ran away from the drug test. Not a polite decline, not a scheduling conflict, but a full sprint out of the building like a man whose life depended on it. The optics were devastating. Here was a fighter who'd built his reputation on never backing down from anyone, suddenly fleeing from a simple urine sample. The Nevada Commission immediately launched an investigation. Silva's team scrambled to explain the situation. They claimed he'd taken a diuretic, something that could mask other substances in drug tests. But admitting to taking a diuretic was almost as bad as failing the test itself. What made the situation worse was Silva's response to the controversy. Instead of quietly accepting whatever punishment was coming, he went on the offensive. He criticized the UFC, called their drug testing policies unfair, and suggested the entire system was designed to destroy fighters' careers. These weren't the words of a man ready to take responsibility for his actions. The Nevada Commission wasn't interested in excuses. When they couldn't complete the drug test because Silva had fled, they treated it as a positive result. The punishment was swift and brutal. A lifetime ban from competing in Nevada, along with a massive fine. For a fighter whose career was already on thin ice, this was a death sentence. But the story doesn't end there. Silva attempted a comeback, apologizing for his behavior and claiming he'd learned from his mistakes. The Nevada Commission eventually overturned his lifetime ban, reducing it to a suspension. But the damage to his reputation was irreversible. The UFC, which had already been losing patience with his declining performances, released him entirely. The most tragic part wasn't just the end of Silva's career, but how it ended. Wanderlei Silva's ban from the UFC serves as a cautionary tale about the price of panic. In a sport where reputation is everything, one moment of weakness can destroy decades of achievement. The axe murderer had survived countless wars inside the cage, but he couldn't survive the war with himself. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy a fighter faces isn't standing across the octagon. Sometimes it's staring back from the mirror.
He's done. I don't give a shit if he's the best 170-pounder in the world. He'll never come back here again.
We're talking Paul Daly.
Yeah.
You're cutting him from the UFC.
Yeah. He'll never come back. I'm probably the most lenient guy in sports, and this is probably one of the most lenient organizations. And we're all human. We all make mistakes. Things happen. There's no excuse for that. These guys are professional athletes. You don't ever hit a guy blatantly after the bell like that.
When the final bell rang at UFC 113, Paul Daly had just lost a unanimous decision to Josh Koscheck in what was supposed to be a title eliminator. The winner would face Georges St-Pierre for the welterweight championship. Daly's title dreams were crushed, but what happened next would change everything. In a moment of pure rage, Daly threw a devastating right hand that landed flush on Koscheck's jaw. The problem? The fight was already over. Koscheck was walking away. The referee had already called it. And in that split second, Paul Daly went from UFC contender to banned for life. Dana White didn't hesitate. He cut him that night. Not the next day, not after a hearing, that very night. And he made it clear this wasn't just a release. This was a lifetime ban. No appeals. No second chances. No matter what Daly accomplished outside the UFC, he would never fight in the octagon again. But here's what makes this story fascinating. This wasn't just about one punch after the bell. This was about crossing a line that the UFC had never seen crossed before, and the punishment was so severe that it sent shockwaves through the entire MMA world. Let me paint the picture for you. Josh Koscheck had dominated the fight. He'd taken Daly down repeatedly, controlled him on the ground, and basically made him look helpless for 3 rounds. The British striker, who'd built his reputation on devastating knockouts, couldn't land anything significant. His frustration was building with every takedown, every moment spent on his back, every second that ticked away from his title shot. When that final horn sounded, Daly knew it was over. 3 years of climbing the rankings, gone. His shot at Georges St-Pierre vanished. The biggest moment of his career had slipped through his fingers. And as Koscheck began walking away, celebrating his victory, something snapped. The punch itself was picture perfect. A right hand that would have been beautiful if it had landed during the actual fight. Koscheck never saw it coming. He was defensively vulnerable, not expecting an attack after the final bell. The shot connected clean and sent shockwaves through the arena, but instead of cheers, there was stunned silence. What Daly did violated every principle that mixed martial arts stands for. This isn't street fighting. This isn't some backyard brawl where anything goes. The UFC had spent decades legitimizing the sport, convincing athletic commissions, sponsors, and mainstream media that MMA was a regulated professional competition. One moment of lost control threatened all of that. Dana White's reaction was swift and brutal. He didn't wait for meetings or consultations. The decision was made instantly. Daly was done. And White made sure everyone understood why. The UFC's reputation depended on fighters being able to control ended. Themselves when the competition sportsmanship wasn't optional. It was mandatory. The punishment sent a message that echoed through every locker room, every training camp, and every fighter's mind. No matter how talented you are, no matter how exciting your fights, no matter how much money you can generate, there are lines you cannot cross. And attacking an opponent after the fight is over is the biggest line of all. Other fighters have done terrible things and gotten second chances. They've failed drug tests, been arrested, caused controversies, but none of them threw a punch after the final bell. None of them violated the fundamental trust that exists between competitors when the fight officially ends. Paul Daly's ban wasn't just punishment, it was a statement, a declaration that the UFC values respect and sportsmanship above everything else. And sometimes one moment of rage can cost you everything. 20 years later, that ban still stands. Paul Daly will never fight in the UFC again. One punch after the bell changed his life forever.